December 1944. In the Ardennes the forest looked peaceful, until it did not. Snow softened the roads, fog swallowed the ridgelines, and through that white silence, the German army drove its last great gamble straight into the American line. They called it the Ardennes Offensive. History would call it the Battle of the Bulge. For the men holding thin winter positions, it felt like the world cracking open overnight. German armor poured through the pines. Communications failed. Units vanished from maps between dusk and dawn. In Bastogne, a critical road junction in Belgium, American airborne troops found themselves surrounded, cut off, outgunned, and told by the weather itself that no friendly aircraft would come to save them. The fog was not scenery. It was a weapon. It grounded the Allied fighter bombers that German tank crews feared more than almost anything else on the Western Front. With the sky closed, the panzers could move in daylight again. With the sky closed, the German timetable looked suddenly possible. German officers read the situation with professional satisfaction. The pocket around Bastogne was tightening. The roads that fed the town were gone. The Americans inside were stubborn, but stubbornness without supply is only a delay dressed up as courage. In German headquarters, grease pencils marked the circle around Bastogne with confidence. Surround, starve, break. It was textbook. It was supposed to be inevitable. The German high command needed Bastogne the way a thief needs a door. Without that junction, their armored spearheads would choke on their own success. Fuel columns would snarl. Infantry would stack up behind wrecked vehicles. The offensive would die of traffic. So Bastogne had to fall, and for a few days it looked as if it would. American outposts reported white-clad infantry appearing like ghosts from the tree line. Artillery fell in patterns that suggested the enemy already knew the road net better than some of the defenders. Field hospitals filled. Radios went to static. Men wrote short letters they were not sure would ever leave the pocket. And then from the south came a name the Wehrmacht had learned to hate and still struggled to believe. George S. Patton, Third Army. Patton did not speak like a careful staff officer. He spoke like a man who treated time as an enemy that could be beaten into submission. When the crisis exploded across the Ardennes, he made a promise that sounded to many ears on both sides of the front, like theater. He said he could turn Third Army, disengage from one fight, wheel an entire armored and infantry machine north, through winter roads, and relieve Bastogne, not in weeks, not when the weather cleared, not after a tidy redistribution of supply, but in roughly 48 hours. German officers heard reports of that claim and smiled the way professionals smile at amateurs. You do not pivot a modern army like a parade squad. You do not yank divisions out of contact, reverse their logistics overnight, and hurl them into a blizzard corridor on the strength of a speech. That was not strategy. That was bluffing. To understand why they thought Patton was bluffing, you have to understand what Third Army was already doing. It was not sitting idle in a depot waiting for a dramatic order. It was fighting. It was consuming fuel, ammunition, and road space across a wide front far to the south. Its supply lines pointed one direction. Its maps faced one enemy. Its officers had already planned tomorrow's war in the places they were standing. Now Patton asked them to cancel tomorrow. In the language of staff work, the order was almost insulting in its simplicity. Turn. Go north. Break the ring around Bastogne. Do it now. Inside American command posts, some officers felt the same disbelief the Germans felt, only quieter and buried under loyalty. Maps do not care about legend. Snow does not care about reputation. An armored division cannot teleport across Belgium because a general wants a headline. Staff officers ran the numbers: fuel requirements, road capacity, maintenance shortfalls. The distance between where Third Army was and where Bastogne needed it to be. On paper, the promise looked impossible. On paper, the Germans were right to laugh. But Patton's war was never only about paper. Patton believed the German advantage was temporary weather and temporary shock. He believed the American advantage was something deeper and less romantic. Trucks, fuel, workshops, radios, engineer battalions, and a culture that treated movement itself as a weapon. While German columns still leaned on horses for a huge share of their logistics, American armies moved like factories on wheels. That fact did not appear in propaganda posters. It appeared in quartermaster tables. It appeared in fuel dumps laid out like industrial parks. It appeared in the red ball mathematics of continuous truck loops that European staff colleges still struggled to imagine as normal. So Patton did not answer the German's smile with a better speech. He answered with a timetable. Third Army began to peel away from its southern fight. Columns reversed under blackout discipline. Engineers scraped ice from grades that wanted to kill every truck that tried them. Military police seized intersections and turned them into valves controlling an entire army's bloodstream. Tank transporters and supply trucks fought for the same narrow Belgian roads like animals at a single waterhole. Men who had slept for 2 hours were told to drive for 12. Cooks dumped breakfast into the snow because the column could not stop. Tank crews tuned engines in the dark with fingers too cold to feel the tools. Signal units restrung the nervous system of Third Army while the body was already moving. This is the part romantic histories skip. The glamour is the general with the ivory-handled pistols and the hard stare for the cameras. The truth is a convoy stuck behind a wrecker in a snowstorm. The truth is a radio net screaming for priority while 3 colonels claim the same road. The truth is a bridge that might hold one more Sherman, or might not, and a lieutenant who has 30 seconds to decide. German reconnaissance reported movement to the south. Staff officers debated what it meant over cold coffee and inaccurate maps. Some argued it was a local reaction, a probing reshuffle. Some argued Patton was posturing for Allied newspapers, performing toughness for London and Washington. Few wanted to accept the simplest and most dangerous reading of the evidence. He meant exactly what he said. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held the town like a fist inside a closing glove. They were cold in a way that goes past discomfort and into a kind of slow drowning. They were short of medical supplies. They were writing the story of Bastogne with empty stomachs and, when necessary, captured German ammunition. A German demand for surrender arrived under flag of truce, wrapped in formal language and absolute confidence. The American answer became legend for its brevity. Nuts. But legends do not open roads. Armor does. Trucks do. Engineers do. A general's promise only becomes history when the road net agrees. Patton's northward drive was not elegant. It was brutal, imperfect, and fast. Units arrived out of sequence. Some roads clogged into steel traffic jams. Some attacks stalled against villages that looked small on maps and felt endless on the ground. Winter punished everyone equally, German and American, with black ice, whiteout, frostbite, and vehicles that refused to start, and still the arrow on the map kept bending north. Every hour that Third Army moved was an hour German certainty leaked away, because the German plan for Bastogne depended on time. Time to crush the pocket before relief could arrive. Time to keep Allied armor distant. Time to prove that American promises were noise, loud, theatrical, and empty. Patton was stealing that time in truckloads. He was converting the one resource German officers thought they still owned, the calendar, into an American weapon. Inside the German ring, reports from the southern approaches grew harder to dismiss. Gunfire where there should have been silence. Dust and exhaust where there should have been only snow. A pressure against the siege lines that did not feel like a raid. Sieges die in 2 ways. They die from the inside when the surrounded collapse, or they die from the outside when someone cuts a seam in the ring. Bastogne was about to learn the second death. When the corridor finally cracked open, it did not look like a parade. It looked like smoke on a tree line. It looked like tanks grinding forward through orchards turned into abattoirs of bark and wire. It looked like infantry clearing the village one frozen doorway at a time, tossing grenades into cellars that might hold civilians, or machine guns, or both. It looked like exhausted men meeting exhausted men and realizing the geometry of the war had changed. The surrounded became the linked. The junction that German officers had circled as doomed became a hinge again. Relief reached Bastogne, not as a single cinematic moment, but as a grinding sequence of openings, widenings, and desperate defenses of a corridor that could still have snapped shut. Ammo moved, wounded moved, fuel moved. The town that had been a pocket became a position again. In German headquarters, the smile had nowhere left to go. The bluff had become a schedule completed under fire. Not perfectly, not bloodlessly, but truly. What broke in that moment was not only a siege, it was a theory of the war. The theory said American generals were loud. The theory said American soldiers were soft. The theory said American claims were theater, written for newspapers and politicians. The theory said that when an American promised the impossible, you could safely wait him out. Patton forced a different conclusion. American industrial war could convert arrogance into a rival. German officers had not been foolish to doubt the promise. By ordinary European staff logic, 48 hours to swing an army into a winter relief operation was absurd. Divisions need roads. Roads need priority. Priority needs a hierarchy that does not dissolve under panic. Fuel needs dumps. Dumps need trucks. Trucks need tires, drivers, spare parts, and military police who can make 1,000 selfish units behave like one animal. Their error was not mathematical. Their error was civilizational. They measured Patton against the army they had become by late 1944, an army short of fuel, short of trucks, short of time, still dragging horses through a war of engines. They did not measure him against the army he actually commanded, a machine that could reassign its own gravity. To understand the scale of what German officers misread, go back 1 week before the corridor opened. Third Army was still facing east and southeast, grinding through a different war. Orders, fuel allocations, maintenance cycles, and artillery ammunition dumps were all aimed at a front that was about to become yesterday's problem. The pivot north was not a single order barked in a tent. It was hundreds of orders. It was the unglamorous violence of rewriting an army's memory while the army was still awake. Division commanders received fragmentary instructions and had to improvise the rest. Regimental officers argued over road serials like men fighting for oxygen. A column given priority at dawn could lose it by noon when a higher headquarters changed the valve again. In that chaos, Patton's reputation mattered, not as mythology, but as a forcing function. People moved because they believed he would not accept delay as an explanation. German intelligence, reading fragments of Allied radio traffic and prisoner talk, kept searching for a cleaner story. Was this a spoiling attack? Was it a local counterpunch to protect a shoulder of the bulge? Was Patton's name being used as propaganda cover for a smaller force? They wanted the movement to be smaller than it was, because if it was as large as it looked, their timetable for Bastogne was already dying. Consider the weather again, not as atmosphere, but as a judge. For days the fog had protected German armor from Allied air power. German officers treated that fog like an ally that would stay loyal long enough. Then the sky began to change. When the weather opened, fighter-bombers returned like a verdict. Roads that had been safe for panzer columns in whiteout became hunting grounds. Fuel trucks that German logistics could not spare became burning markers on the map. The same winter that had grounded the Allies now punished the attackers for believing weather was a permanent shield. Patton's northward push and the returning air umbrella were not the same weapon, but they arrived in the same argument. German officers had counted on American delay. They got American convergence instead, ground movement from the south, steel from the sky, and a pocket that refused to die politely. Inside Bastogne, men who had measured their future in hours suddenly measured it in possibilities again. A corridor is not comfort, it is a chance, but a chance is everything when the alternative is annihilation by mathematics. There is a temptation, especially in later storytelling, to make Bastogne into a miracle of personality alone. Patton the prophet, Patton the warrior saint, Patton the man who bent reality by sheer will. That story is incomplete to the point of falsehood. Yes, Patton forced tempo. Yes, he made a promise that terrified ordinary staff logic. But the promise only became true because American war was already an industrial system wearing a general's face. Trucks existed in numbers German quartermasters could not match. Fuel existed in dumps German bombers could no longer reliably destroy. Radio nets, military police, engineer battalions, and maintenance companies existed as a nervous system that could survive a violent change of direction. German officers thought they were evaluating a man. They were evaluating the civilization's capacity to move metal. That is why the bluff stung so deeply when it stopped being a bluff. It revealed that their model of the enemy was obsolete. They were still fighting a European army of scarcity. Patton was commanding an American army of surplus under pressure. Bruised, imperfect, furious, and able to reassign its weight faster than doctrine said was decent. After Bastogne, the Battle of the Bulge still had weeks of killing left in it. The snow still took men in the night. The map still bled at the edges. Villages still changed hands in fights that would never get a famous name. German units still fought with a ferocity born of desperation and ideology. American units still paid for every mile in frostbite, wrecked tanks, and letters that would never be answered. But the strategic illusion of a German knockout blow in the West was dying in daylight. The offensive that began as a gamble for Antwerp and panic in Allied capitals became a costly protrusion that Allied armies would grind down with artillery, air power, and relentless reinforcement. And in that grinding, the memory of the so-called bluff remained useful, not as a joke, as a warning, and the lesson traveled farther than Belgium. When an enemy decides you are bluffing, they are betting that your words are larger than your logistics. They are betting that your legend is a costume. They are betting that your timetable is a performance. Patton's answer was to make logistics larger than their imagination. He did not win the argument in a tent with a clever line for the history books. He won it on icy roads with columns that refused to stay where the enemy expected them. He won it with staff work that looked boring until it became decisive. He won it with the ugly, unphotogenic miracle of an army that could change direction without dying of its own weight. In the end, German officers learned what many Allied officers already feared and respected. Patton's threats were not decorations on a uniform. They were deadlines with tracks and engines attached. The bluff was a timetable, and the timetable arrived. What remains after the slogans fade is a colder kind of history. Not the poster of Patton, not the one-word legend from Bastogne. The colder history is the road serial, the fuel dump, the military policeman at a frozen crossroads, deciding which column lives and which column waits. German officers thought they could read American intention the way they read European armies, by counting divisions on a map and assuming those divisions were as slow as their own. They underestimated the American ability to treat an army like a movable factory. They underestimated how quickly surplus, under ruthless command, becomes speed. That underestimation cost them Bastogne's timeline. It cost them the remaining credibility of the Ardennes gamble, and it left a lesson that outlived the snow. When a modern industrial army says it will arrive, do not confuse volume of speech with emptiness of means. Patton's so-called bluff was never primarily a psychological trick. It was a logistics claim under combat conditions. He put his reputation on a clock. Then he made the clock true with steel, rubber, radio, and men who drove until their hands stopped feeling the wheel. In the winter of 1944, German officers learned the